Okay, hello again and good morning, everybody. Welcome to this very first session of the 12th Annual Canadian Water Summit. As mentioned, my name is Richard Farthing-Nichol. I'm the Director at the Forum for Leadership on Water. And during this session, we have an hour and we're going to explore different perspectives on the development of the new Canada Water Agency. But before we begin, I'd like to first acknowledge the Indigenous land that we're all coming together on. So first, I'll start by making a few acknowledgements. And because this is a virtual event that includes people from right across the country, I'd encourage each of you to reflect on the land that you're joining us from as well. And if you feel inclined, throw a message in the Whova chat function and let us know the Indigenous land that you're joining from. So first, I'll start by acknowledging the land on which Water Canada and the Canadian Water and Wastewater Association operate, so the two conference organizers. CWWA is based in Ottawa, which has been the traditional land of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation for millennia. Water Canada's parent company, Actual Media, is based in Toronto. For thousands of years, Toronto has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, Seneca, and more recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, Toronto is still home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and Water Canada is grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I myself am based in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Manitoba includes the territories of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Dakota, Dene, Métis, and Oji-Cree nations, and Winnipeg is part of Treaty 1 territory. And because actions alongside words are important, I also just want to take this opportunity to emphasize my commitment, personal and professional, towards realizing the goals of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as well as the TRC calls to action. So once again, I just encourage you to reflect on the land that you're joining us from and feel free to share it in the chat. So as mentioned, this is a panel that's focusing on the development of the Canada Water Agency. And the agency, while its name and the idea is becoming pretty well recognized across the water community, it's important to note that it doesn't yet exist as a physical entity. It's an idea and it's a concept. And it's one that was first proposed during the 2019 federal election as a way to keep our water safe, clean, and well managed. And since then, Environment and Climate Change Canada has done a bunch of work trying to figure out what the agency will look like. So we've had public consultations. There's an online platform for people to submit their comments and ideas. And in December 2020, we had a discussion paper. And then just last week, we had what we heard consultation summary released by Environment Canada. Also important to note that in the federal budget released in April of this year, there's $17.4 million over 2 years dedicated to establishing the agency. So there's a lot of conversation around the agency. There's a lot of hopes, aspirations, and questions, and that's what we're here to discuss today. So I'll be speaking from my perspective as the Director of Flow. We're a federal water law and policy organization, and we've done a lot of work on the agency in the past couple of years, including some reports and some analyses that you can find on our website. And I'm really excited to be joined by 4 distinguished panelists, each of whom will provide their own unique perspective on the agency. And to get us started today, before we get into the questions, I just wanted to ask each of the panelists to provide a brief introduction of themselves and just talk a little bit about their relationship to the agency and any work they've done on it to date. So to get us started, I'm going to pass it over to Michael Goffin. Michael is the Director General, Water Policy at Environment and Climate Change Canada. Michael?
Okay, thank you, Richard. So I do work for Environment and Climate Change Canada. I know a number of participants today. I've spent the past 20 years working on Great Lakes water quality issues, have been responsible for coordinating Canada's response to the Canada-US Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. And then for the last a year and a bit, I have been the Director General responsible for managing the Canada Water Agency project. So responsible for developing proposals on mandate and structure of that agency. And I'm pleased to be here today. I'm speaking to you from the traditional territories of many First Nations, including the Haudenosaunee and the Huron-Wendat, as well as the traditional and treaty territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Melissa Hotain is the Director of Intergovernmental Affairs from Sioux Valley, Dakota Nation. Melissa?
Hi, good morning. Yes, my name is Melissa Hotain. I am the Director of Intergovernmental Affairs from the Sioux Valley Dakota Nation and coming to you from the Northern Traditional Territories of our Dakota people in what is now Southern Manitoba. I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers for recognizing the loss that is being deeply felt in our Indigenous communities across Canada. I am the daughter and granddaughter of residential school survivors, so I understand all too well the impacts from the Indian residential schools. What I will be sharing today is just some preliminary information that came from discussions in our community that on the development of the Canada Water Agency. And the information I share today is based on my opinion and the opinions of my community only. I am not here to speak on behalf of Indigenous communities in general. And I use that word as it seems to be what I call the word of the day. We went from being labeled Indians to First Nations to Aboriginal, now Indigenous. However, the politically correct term is where we come from, and that is our individual nations. So mine is being the Dakota Nation. The engagement that we conducted was over a very brief period this winter to look at the discussion paper and to have some water discussions in our community. It was a very short time frame and really cannot be taken as fulsome or meaningful consultation, rather used to start the conversation on water and to identify priorities in relation to freshwater management in our community. So to me, it is important to begin by sharing and acknowledging the importance of water to our community. In our language, in our Dakota language, we say mini wichoni, which means water is life. The source of life itself, vital and sacred to our way of life, ceremonies, traditions, and culture. It is also important to acknowledge our inherent and constitutionally protected water rights. These rights outline our right to govern, manage, and protect water. So there is an opportunity through these discussions to conduct collaborative work concerning protection of water and actions toward pollution, waste management, environmental emergencies that may affect our bodies of water, as well as the groundwater. So I'm here again as to offer preliminary issues and to consider, and also based on my previous work experience and some high-level recommendations on Indigenous engagement. So I thank you for the opportunity to be part of this panel, and I look forward to the dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. Next, we'll go to Amy Winchester. Amy is a registered professional engineer working for the St. John, New Brunswick office of CBCL Limited. She's also the vice chair of the Climate Change Committee of the Canadian Water and Wastewater Association. Amy?
Thanks, Richard. And I'm very grateful to be part of this panel, a little bit humble too with the other voices in here, and then to represent CWWA. I did want to start off with my own land acknowledgement. I'm presenting today from Ross, New Brunswick. This land is a traditional unceded territory of the Wolastoqey and Mi'kmaq people. The territory is covered by the Treaties of Peace and Friendship, which the Wolastoqey and the Mi'kmaq peoples have first signed with the British Crown in 1725. And I know we have a long way to go, but I am very happy to see the acknowledgement both at this conference and other conferences, my place of work, municipalities and beyond. So hopefully we'll keep moving in a positive direction. So like Richard said, I'm speaking today on behalf of the Canadian Water and Wastewater Association. My day job is with CBCL Engineering firm. We're an environmental engineering firm operated in Atlantic Canada and in Ottawa. And I've been fortunate to work with water my entire career. So I deal with both water treatment for everything from source through treatment out to distribution, as well as collection of sewage into treatment plants and then effluent into our receiving waters. I've worked on a wide variety of projects from environmental risk assessments to the receiving waters, the permitting process. So I've got a unique view of kind of the full holistic sense of the water cycle, from use, regulatory for the different land uses, consultation, engagement around all of it. So the Canada Water Agency is very interesting to me in some improvements that we can see. And then as my role as vice chair of the Climate Change Committee of CWWA, I think Robert's talked about this before, but CWWA is the voice of the municipalities and utilities in Canada. So we are linked to many, many voices across the country. And that's a little bit of some of the insight that I'll be talking about today on the panel.
Thanks very much, Amy. And our last panelist is Lara Ellis. Lara is a Senior Vice President, Policy and Partnerships at ALUS Canada. Lara?
Hi, thanks for the opportunity to be here today. Hello to my fellow panelists and everybody in the audience. I'd like to acknowledge that I live and work on the lands of the Mississaugas of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat. I also recognize the enduring presence of First Nations, Métis, and the Inuit peoples in Toronto. Some of you might be wondering why I'm on the panel. I work for an NGO called ALUS, Alternative Land Use Services. We work with farmers and ranchers across the country in 31 communities to support their efforts in restoring nature on their lands, doing things like wetland restoration, riparian buffers, tree planting, anything green. We work very closely with municipalities, particularly in Alberta, where our community program is established in 17 municipalities. And of course, water is central for farming, ranching. Our farmers and ranchers are on the front lines of climate change. So they need water, and obviously they impact water. We're trying to understand better how we can target resources for restoration in the areas with the most impact. So we've been doing some modeling with University of Guelph to understand best management practices, what their outcomes are, where the most high value areas for those projects are. And that modeling we've finished so far in the Lake Erie Basin and 3 sub-watersheds, and also northwest of Edmonton. So, the original mandate for the CWWA was that the Environment Minister would work with the Minister of Agriculture, acknowledging, of course, the important role of water on the working landscapes across Canada. So we have submitted ideas about what we think priorities are, and looking forward to being to raise some of those over the course of this panel. Thanks.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you all for those introductions. So the rest of our time is committed to discussion, and we have some questions prepared, but what we'd really love is questions to be submitted by the folks who are joining us for this session. So you can do so through the Whova app. If you have any questions, put them in that chat and they should be addressed. But I'd encourage you, if you have questions right now, please submit them, or if at any point during our discussion you have a question to one or all of the panelists, just let us know and we'll try to get to as many as we can. But to start us off, I'm going to pose a question to all of the panelists, and whoever is most keen can take this one. But I just wanted to start at a high level, and in your view, or your organization's view, what are the most important issues that should be addressed by the Canada Water Agency, and how can the agency begin addressing these issues? So whoever wants to take that can unmute, or maybe Lara can take it because you're already unmuted.
Oh, okay. Well, we've already mentioned climate change a few times, so we know, intensifying, more intense storms, changing seasons are all having a considerable impact. Natural infrastructure is something that this government has supported through different programs. So I think really understanding the impact, the scale of natural infrastructure to help with water scarcity, on one hand, too much water on the other hand with increasing floods, and then water quality, right? So how does that programming fit within the other water programs that different levels of government are supporting? How can it help reduce costs for built infrastructure? And sort of what's the sweet spot between built and natural infrastructure to help our municipalities and our communities do as well as they can in terms of, some really extreme range of things that we're seeing across the country throughout the year. Should I mute when I'm not talking so you don't call on me again? Or
I won't call on you again. Thank you.
I can jump in, Richard, if that's okay. Okay. So CWWA, on behalf of its membership, we've had some multiple meetings, I guess, to discuss the Canada Water Agency, the discussion paper. And we were very happy to be part of Flo's discussion as well on some of the comments back. And, you know, we all agree it's a very positive step that the government is looking to take. Some of the issues that have come up for us, among many, is that from the regulatory side, there are dozens of agencies that work with water in its simplest form. So from municipalities' perspective, you know, it could be Health Canada with the Canada Drinking Water Quality Guidelines. It could be CCME with municipal effluent regulations, DFO, any of the Environment Canada release of deleterious materials, and we can go on and on and on. And so it becomes very confusing to get work done from a municipal perspective to try to deal with one, cross-jurisdictional regulation, so that would be provincial and federal, but also even between all the different departments, and figuring out who to call and what applications to go through and who to chat with. So one of the key pieces that's very enticing and intriguing with the Canada Water Agency is to start to provide more of a common collective voice to help navigate through that, to make sure from a holistic level that everything's being considered. So that's one thing that's you know, we're hoping that moves forward. Another part is a national database full of data and information. So there's so much information collected across the country, and I know there's been platforms set up in the past. And there's been platforms set up. MPRI is one that was set up for air, you know, a while ago. And there's no reason not to have this collection of data, especially with open source and the ability that we do many, many things now with technology. So some thought into a national database of all the information. The final part that we've discussed is that the CWWA is their mandate and what they're proposing is very large, because there's so much to consider, that we don't want to wait till everything's perfect to get going. You know, that's another message that we have. It's we don't want this to be something that is discussed forever and ever and nothing happens. It's to try to move on some of these things, because it's going to take a long time to work it all out, but not to wait to get started. So those are probably the high points.
I just want to echo what was already stated, because one of the key priority issues that came out for our area was climate change. What people have observed and seen over the last 20, 30 years, and our ability to adapt to those impacts. We are in a situation where we have perennial flooding. You know, it's resulting in erosion, high sediment in our rivers, impacts to our traditional livelihoods, and obviously impacts downstream. Impacts to plants and medicines as well. But in addition to that, we're also more concerned about as was stated, the more severe storms. The Prairie Climate Center's long-term model showing hotter and drier seasons that are coming up in the next decade or two. And how is that going to impact our source water and our groundwater? So we have great concerns for that, because we're already in a situation where we're experiencing low aquifers, and where we have to conduct a search for more viable drinking water. So that will be compounded in the future if we don't do something about that now. Another thing that came up was the need for water monitoring at the local level, more supports, programming, funding, and building capacity so that we can participate in understanding water quality and monitoring at our local level. And the need for data to make informed decisions, or a better understanding of how to access and interpret that data at the local level as well. I find that we also fall into what is called the jurisdictional divide, where we're considered federal, but we're also overseen by provincial standards and laws, etc. So there's always that trying to understand where and how those things apply to our communities. So I offer that. Thank you.
Well, maybe I can round it out then, just start by saying that, and I think Richard, you touched on this, that no decisions have yet been made on mandate or structure of the agency, and ultimately those decisions will have to be made by cabinet. But we are working to generate options for consideration, and As you also noted, Richard, we recently completed our public and stakeholder engagement process. We have an ongoing process to engage with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. And we've released a report on that public and stakeholder engagement. If people haven't seen it, a number of the issues identified by the other panelists were highlighted as central themes, the most frequently heard things coming out of that engagement. Definitely climate change is front and center, and I would say seen as an element of all other issues. So, you know, when we talk about data or monitoring or floods, there are climate change aspects to those. A lot of interest in the Canada Water Agency being a central coordinator of freshwater science, freshwater data, not just making it more accessible, but making it interoperable so that you can combine data and informed decision making so that decisions are made with the best possible information. Coordination federally and with provinces and territories, we heard a lot about. I like the jurisdictional divide reference as a way of describing that. You know, I think there's a lot of frustration out there amongst government, non-government, Indigenous people and others about differing jurisdictions. We are committed in developing the Canada Water Agency not to encroach on jurisdictions, but to look at better ways of collaborating. Just quickly, the other central themes that we highlighted in that What We Heard report included watershed governance, including work on transboundary waters, where the Canadian public looked to the federal government to play a key role with provinces and territories and with the US. Being responsive to regional water priorities, so recognizing that water priorities do differ across this country, and so the agency has to be responsive to that. Advancing reconciliation with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people was also highlighted, and we're very interested in that continuing engagement to work with First Nation, Métis, and Inuit to determine how best the agency can do that. And then the last in my list here is engaging Canadians. So making sure Canadians have information on the state of fresh water, both quality and quantity, and freshwater ecosystems, and opportunities to participate.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, everybody. Just the only thing I'll add from a flow perspective is that, you know, we have been working on this for a while and talking about the agency for a while. As Amy mentioned, we convened some groups earlier this year and came up with a document that we called our 5 foundational pillars. So really just broad cross-cutting priorities for the agency. And I think that document, the What We Heard paper, the consultations, the answers here today, really show just how high the expectations are. I mean, this is the biggest federal water policy development in quite a while. So I think there's a lot of hopes and aspirations for the agency, which is totally fair. But I think from our perspective, it's going to take time to build up the capacity that the agency needs. It's going to take time to build the mandate. So what we're advocating for is really just getting the agency established as a first step, not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, and just establishing the agency, defining the mandate over time, developing the capacity over time, starting to work on immediate priorities. And I think a widely recognized one is getting the federal house in order. So figuring out how the agencies and departments that are responsible for water can work together better. The data piece is huge. So all of these different pieces of data that are out there being collected by different levels of government and organizations and community-based water monitoring, but having the agency be a central repository and a hub for that data. And then reconciliation, that's of course a huge priority. So co-developing the mandate with Indigenous nations. I think there's things that can be worked on right away. There's things that are medium and long-term goals, but we just really want to see the agency be established. So we're pushing for quicker establishment and then building over time rather than waiting too long. Okay, I don't see any questions from the audience just yet. So we'll move to the second question we have here. And this is about working with different levels of government. So we know that water governance across the country is very complex with federal, provincial, municipal, Indigenous governments, as well as all the non-governmental actors. So I'd be curious to hear from the panelists thoughts on how the Canada Water Agency should work with different levels of government. You can speak to all of them or whichever you prefer, but how can the Canada Water Agency most effectively work with provincial, municipal, and Indigenous governments?
I can go first. So I think, you know, in our submissions around the Canada Water Agency, we thought, you know, 17.5 million is a lot of money, but in ways it's not a lot of money, right? So I think that to build confidence in a Canada Water Agency, it might be wise to pick some priority areas and really sort of dig in and show some early results. So whether those are, you know, in watersheds where there are communities in crisis, if it's Lake Erie Basin, of course, with the 40% phosphorus reduction target, Lake Winnipeg, Lake Simcoe, maybe some of the big Western watersheds. I think, you know, some geographic, picking a geographic priority area might make sense. And then try to dig into some of these. I think Amy was, you know, mentioning that there are, you know, conflicting mandates, policies, laws, right, between agriculture and environment, for instance. So can we figure out how to move forward with, you know, proactive steps to protect water, reduce pollution with these different agencies that are often, not often, but, you know, work at cross purposes sometimes. So that would be my take on that.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. The one thing that we talked about in our smaller group was that there are already examples of things that work. With Health Canada's Canadian Drinking Water Quality Guidelines, that is multi-jurisdictional. They have a whole process. When we talk about clean water going from, you know, from the municipal perspective out to the customers, you know, there's the Canadian Drinking Water Quality Guidelines that are established with a lot of research that goes into what the guidelines need to be. And then they're funneled through to recommendations in terms of acts regulations down at the provincial level, and then out in terms of municipality. So there are intergovernmental processes that work and work quite well. All of those require some consultation and engagement. So they have figured out how to do it. There's other parts with CCME and municipal effluent guidelines. The Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency works often at a certain level for an environmental assessment, and provinces have their own environmental assessments. And I'm not saying that process is perfect, but certainly there's examples out there. They don't need to reinvent the wheel. And so they can go look at some of the successful applications of the cross-jurisdictional regulations and so on that's been happening elsewhere, you know, as well as ones that are happening, and maybe they can find some ways to improve them.
So I've been looking at this question more from a fundamental level and working with Indigenous governments, and it's fundamentally about the duty to consult in all parts of this development of this agency. You know, the Crown has that constitutional duty to directly consult with Aboriginal people when it contemplates conduct or decision that may have an adverse impact on a recognized or asserted Aboriginal treaty right. And I've stated already the inherent right to water. So there are nationally existing First Nation or Indigenous consultation protocols, whether they're by region, by treaty area, et cetera. And those should be utilized or sought on how best to conduct meaningful consultation. So they are the source of how that would be developed. You know, and I also refer to UNDRIP as it's being talked about in Bill C-15, but, you know, it sets out those minimal standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of Indigenous peoples. And there's various articles that set those out. I'm not going to go into details on them, but I refer you to Articles 18 and 19, that really speak to, you know, free, prior, and informed consent before adopting and implementing legislative or administrative measures that could be effective and affect people. So essentially, there needs to be ongoing and effective discussions and resources to support the capacity of Indigenous communities to participate in these discussions. So I just, again, having some existing networks already out there, I've kind of reached out to a few other regions to see what's been happening. Has anyone, conducted any discussions or analysis on this? And it hasn't, this hasn't been that much yet from what I've understand. So I know that I heard you talk about the ongoing, that's good, that even though some consultation is in it, it'll still be ongoing for Indigenous communities. So I'm hoping that that'll happen in a good way. So thank you.
So it's a central question, I think, in creating the Canada Water Agency. Our first step was to take a step back and look at what's occurring now. Just at the federal level, we counted over 20 departments and agencies which have tentacles into fresh water. So their mandates touch on fresh water either directly or indirectly. And while there are, some existing effective mechanisms for coordination, they aren't everywhere, and they could be improved. And I would say the same in terms of working with other governments, certainly with provincial and territorial government. And so for me, it's figuring out how to coordinate so that we can bring whole of government solutions to problems, not get caught in silos, and opening up the best solutions when you look across mandates, and you're not restricted by mandates because you have everyone at the table. The other aspect of that is setting clear priorities. So I think, we have a lot of expertise, but we don't always focus that on the key priorities. So again, bringing people to the table, the right people, all levels of government, Indigenous government, and identifying key priorities and then working jointly on those.
Yeah, I would echo that. And just at a high level, I mean, surely working with different levels of government is going to look different in every circumstance, provincial, municipal, Indigenous, and then the different types of governments within those. But I think, well, the narrative of the agency from what we've seen has changed a bit. And at the beginning, there was a bit of opposition from some provinces specifically who saw that the agency might be a threat to their jurisdiction. I think the focus of the agency and the narrative of the agency has to be to show that the agency is not a threat. It won't be a threat. It shouldn't be a threat, but it's very much a value add. So it's not infringing on the jurisdiction of different levels of government. It's enhancing them by helping those governments work together better, by really just being that kind of oversight and central repository, and establishing new lines of coordination and cooperation. So data, once again, is a big one. Also things like watershed agreements and transboundary agreements for different levels of government to work together to manage waters that they share. The agency has a ton of value add in these ways. And I think if that narrative can reach these different levels of government that might be kind of cautiously eyeing the agency, I think that would go a long way. Okay, so we do have a question from the audience. I think, Amy, you might have addressed this a little bit in your answer, but the question is, how are water and wastewater regulators connected, and how do they collaborate on land use planning process and changes? Are there any common actions or plans that we could learn from?
So I think that's a great question. And again, based on my experience, I would say on one hand, they're not connected, meaning that that's I think part of something that the Canada Water Agency can help with, which is breaking down, an individual project that we're looking at water and source water data to customers, versus looking at, a treatment plant that's looking at taking the effluent, or sorry, taking the wastewater and discharging it. There be certainly processes depending on the scale of the project, if it involves Canadian environmental impact assessment, or depending on a provincial level, that it starts to broaden who's looking at the project. But a lot of times it could just be one entity. Again, at the provincial level, certain people are aware of what's going on. So if you're looking at a drinking water system, and then you have to, or whether it's a surface water system or a groundwater system, then there's some effort on terms of the source of the water and how that impacts impacts the environment around it. But really bridging that water and wastewater, there's probably no straight answer to say that those are always looked at from a holistic level. And I really do think that's something that the Canada Water Agency can help with, Michael. And I think you talked about that too. We want to, or somebody said that we want to do the best project. We want to make sure it's the right project that's happening, not necessarily a good project in one little silo. So I don't think I really answered the question, because, and that doesn't mean that there's not more out there that I'm not aware of, but I think that highlights part of the function of the Canada Water Agency.
Maybe I'll just add, again, we want to be respectful of jurisdictions, and so water, wastewater is largely provincial and territorial responsibility. But one of the aspects that we've been looking at as we think about the Canada Water Agency is the ability to bring people together and do what we call policy research. So take an issue like that and say, well, why don't we look at how well it's managed now, and what are the opportunities to do better, and what's being done globally that we could bring to bear, and then how might we move forward on that together. So I think there is opportunity for the Canada Water Agency to play a role, but it would have to be in close partnership with provinces and territories in that particular instance.
Yeah, and beyond that, Michael, you're right. And even the planning of your water system and your wastewater system now gets back very much down to the municipal level. So there are different responsibilities required in there. And again, not to say that there's not a thought there. The part of CCME and the environmental risk assessments that are happening with wastewater is to look at the use of the water where the effluent is discharged. So it's, it's not a matter of having blinders on for any one of these things, but it's certainly a good question on, can we do it better?
Okay, thank you both. We have a couple of questions I'm going to combine into one. They're both about scale. So the first question is asking about data collection and how local the data will be. So it will be collected on a provincial or watershed basis, or just be a repository of links. The second question is asking about how will the CWWA measure priority for resolving issues within geographic areas? So what scales are considered? Size, location, number of community members, etc. So I just wanted to combine those. You can speak to the data collection or for resolving issues, either one. But I think the crux of both these questions is, what scale should a Canada Water Agency operate, and what should it take as its kind of primary units of analysis? Okay, I'll start us off. I haven't done that yet. We're very much of the opinion that the Canada Water Agency should operate at a river basin or a watershed scale. That's easier said than done, for sure. When you operate at a watershed scale, you have many different intersecting jurisdictions and a lot of different competing interests to take into account. But it's essential for properly managing water to pay attention to those ecological boundaries. And as I mentioned earlier, I think the agency can play a unique role in helping to enable that kind of water governance. It's difficult for any one jurisdiction to do it on its own, but the federal government in a leadership role, kind of bringing different jurisdictions to the table, so provinces, territories, Indigenous governments, can help create agreements and build shared governance tables that really look at watershed as a whole. And it's not going to be, conflict free, and for sure there's competing interests, but getting toward that end goal of managing according to watershed boundaries, I think, is a really good long-term goal of the agency.
Well, maybe I can jump in and say that all of the work on the Canada Water Agency is in relation to a mandate commitment, a mandate from the Prime Minister to, in the case of the Canada Water Agency, the Minister of the Environment and Climate Change Canada, Agriculture, Agri-Foods Canada, and more recently, Minister of Natural Resources and Minister Carr, the Special Representative for the Prairies. But there is another mandate commitment in the letter from the Prime Minister to the Minister of the Environment and Climate Change Canada. And that is to develop further protections and take action to clean up the Great Lakes, Lake Winnipeg, Lake Simcoe, and other large lakes. We are integrating that commitment into our thinking as we look at the Canada Water Agency so that we can address fresh water in an integrated way. And we are, taking that commitment not just to be a focus on large lakes, but other major water bodies. So that is part of our ongoing analysis in terms of scale. So those are all watershed-based initiatives, and I'm sure a number of people have been actively involved in those over the years. Some of them, like the Great Lakes, have been around for a long time, and actually the Great Lakes Initiative will celebrate its 50th anniversary next year. On data as a specific issue, it's an interesting one. I think we're looking at that from two perspectives. One is use of existing data. So there's a large amount of data now. So it's that question of access and interoperability. So we're not restricting it by scale. We're saying all data we think should be available. There are some restrictions, legal restrictions, but where it can be shared, it should be shared. And so how could we help facilitate that? And then the other question is, where is there a need for additional data? So that's that monitoring question. And I think, what we've heard through our consultations, we held expert workshops on both science and data, as well as our stakeholder and public engagement sessions. And what we heard was you have to link it back to what the decisions are you're trying to make. What questions are you trying to answer? And then figure out what data you need, what monitoring you need, and at what scale you need it. And then set priorities in terms of adding to the existing networks. So I think that's the path that we're heading down right now in terms of our thinking is how do we advance data and monitoring to support decision making. So starting with that question of what are the key decisions, which gets back to what are the key priorities that we want to address.
Anybody else on that question around scale and data?
I've got something that's a little bit on a different tact here.
Sure.
I think that the agency really could play a very interesting role in looking forward, right? So I think, Melissa, you were talking about the work that the Prairie Climate Center had done around, modeling of really hot, longer, hotter summers, wetter shoulder seasons for the next few decades. So the Canada Water Agency really could be saying, okay, if these are potential scenarios, what are we going to do? What are the sort of investments? What are the roles of all the different agencies going to be in our adaptation strategies for what we know is coming down the pipe? So I don't think we've talked about that on the panel, but we have a pretty nightmarish scenario of 50 years from now in certain parts of the country. So I think putting resources and smart people to work figuring out what are our strategies here would be really a good investment.
Yeah, the only other thing I would add on the data side that I actually heard at one of the consultation sessions, and I thought it was a great point, is that we want the data collected in a central repository to be meaningful. And so guidance from the Canada Water Agency on how to collect the data, what information goes along with the data, living in St. John, we've got the highest tides in the world. So if we look at discharges and you measure at low tide, the ecosystem is very different than at high tide. And so if you just take a data point and you add it to a repository without, putting that information around it. And so I'm sure there's lots of data collected out there that maybe could be more meaningful and providing a little bit more guidance. And then beyond that, leveraging the public and the population beyond, whether it's researchers, whether it's project-based, but have more people being able to collect that data, again, with some level of guidance on what that data is. So I think there's lots of opportunities on the data side to both grow it and make it very meaningful and helpful.
Yeah, I'd echo all that and just add that. So we use the phrase creating and mobilizing data a lot for the Canada Water Agency. Creation as to what Michael was talking about, that you look for gaps and then you figure out how to fill those gaps. And maybe that's the agency undertaking some water monitoring on its own, or maybe it's the agency supporting existing groups that are already doing that work. But just as important is, I think what you're talking about, Amy, which is mobilizing data and specifically getting the data out there, for amalgamating data from different sources so that we have comprehensive sets, but then also getting it out there in a way that's really useful for decision makers. So Lara, when we talk about future climate projections and decision making around that 10, 20, 30 years down the road, where's the data for it and how can it be put together in a way that's not off in an inaccessible database, but is actually in decision makers' hands so they can make those informed decisions.
Yeah, the only part, and Laura, you talked that this is, we know the world is changing, especially from a climate perspective. So we also have to be forward thinking in the type of data that we want, that maybe in the past hasn't been as meaningful, but that we want to make sure that that's always looking to the future.
Great. So we have another question, and this is around kind of the ongoing and the planned consultation to get the agency established. And so I'd be curious to hear from the panelists about top priorities and key considerations to keep in mind as the government continues on this engagement process with different levels of government, with Indigenous nations and the general public. What are the important priorities?
Everyone's so polite. Anyway, consultation, trying to get meaningful engagement. It's difficult for a lot of communities that don't have resources, don't have time. So I don't know, you need different strategies, right? In terms of consultation, that's really going to bring all of the different issues to the table.
So go ahead, Michael.
No, go ahead, Amy.
I wasn't sure, is the question related to how to do consultation, or is the question related, is the question related to the consultation piece itself, or what types of subjects will be focused on in consultation?
I think either or, whatever you'd like to speak to.
Okay, because I do think right now the discussion paper set out, some 10 key areas to use to start the discussion. And I'm sure as that goes on, some of those will become more detailed. But what Laura's saying, I think, is really important. Doing consultation and making it meaningful to both listen to a wide variety of people is a science in itself. I have been very impressed with how that consultation has been going, and also very humbled and respecting that it's a massive undertaking to try to hear from so many different organizations and peoples across Canada. But I think too that you can leverage, Environment Canada can leverage a lot of existing associations. So CWWA being one of them, because we do have access to the municipalities across the country, but there's a lot of local associations from local ways that have their conferences set. So it would maybe to investigate what's already out there of places where there's discussions to try to get to get that awareness that it's being done. One, you have to let people know that it's happening, even though you're doing the best you can to try to make it known. There's a lot of people that probably don't even know this is happening. And then two, to try to get their feedback and engagement.
And I think
Go ahead. No, go right ahead.
No, I think I kind of spoke to this previously with regards to the fundamentals of consultation and meaningful engagement within Indigenous communities. So like I stated before, there's already existing protocols in the different areas, and it's really reaching out to them to determine what those best ways and practices are. So, and similar to what Amy had just shared, like a lot of the people at the local level still are not aware of what is happening. Many are just dealing with, everyday issues within their communities that are still not aware of, what's happening and what's being developed. So it's a matter of ensuring greater enhanced communication, ensuring that it gets down to the local level. So that's what I'm offering right now.
I was just going to say that we did do a fairly extensive public and stakeholder engagement process. We ended up hearing from almost 3,000 Canadians, a huge amount of input, and so that's what's reflected in the What We Heard report. We also received detailed comments from all provinces and territories now. So again, a large amount of information. The one area that we haven't been as successful as we would have hoped is in terms of First Nation, Métis, and Inuit engagement. And that's, I would say, largely, almost entirely due to the pandemic and the various waves of the pandemic. So we delayed initiating that process because I always like to say I started on this project the day before I went into quarantine. It was just as the pandemic was taking hold, and so we delayed in consideration of that. In the summer, we reached out to the national Indigenous representatives and asked for guidance in terms of how to move forward. And I would say that at various stages, we from a government perspective and those national organizations from an Indigenous perspective were hopeful that we'd be able to move forward. But it's been a roller coaster, this pandemic, with the various waves. And while we heard a lot of interest from Indigenous communities in engaging, a lot were just not able to carry through on that last year. The funding that's being referenced that was announced in the budget to support development of the agency, $3.5 million of that this current fiscal year is for continued engagement with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. And so we're actively promoting that engagement. We're working principally through, it's a lot of money, but in another respect, when you look at the number of communities across the country, it is not. And so we are working where we can through provincial and territorial organizations now, but also interested to hear from any communities that would like to engage with us.
I have a question with regards to that. How is that going to be allocated? Is that a proposal based?
It is. So if people have an interest, they're welcome to contact me directly, and I can put them in touch with the right individuals. So it is an ongoing process. We are right now focused on analyzing all of the input, and there's depths to the input. So I think the What We Heard report showed what people were suggesting in terms of priorities, but there's a wealth of knowledge that was provided as well in terms of not only what we should focus on, but how we should go about doing it. So we are using that to inform our thinking moving forward. Ultimately, I would say that the government would like to move quickly to create the agency, but at the same time understands that we have to go through appropriate engagement, and so we're trying to balance those two. And in terms of how quickly we move forward.
Thank you all. We're coming to the end here, so maybe we have time for a couple more questions. So let's zoom out and think long-term perspective. We have a question from an audience member. It says, water is one of the key resources for our country and our grandchildren. How will the Canadian Water Agency ensure that this vital resource is protected for future generations?
Each time I go to the wrong place to unmute myself here, so I'll learn just as we're finished the panel discussion. I mean, that's what it's all about. It's what motivated me to want to be part of this project. It's how do we do the best job possible in respect to our water resources. And I guess there's no simple answer to that question. What I would say is that we think this is the most thorough examination of fresh water since the Pierce Inquiry in the 1980s. And I'm encouraged by the level of attention that freshwater is getting amongst the federal family, but also, you know, the very positive response we've received from provinces and territories and others. So I think the time is right. I think people understand that climate change does loom on the horizon in terms of challenges for freshwater management, and the time is right to make sure that we are best organized to address current and future challenges.
That's the only thing I'd say beyond that. I think we all agree. You know, I think the same thing. I think the creation of this Canada Water Agency is the acknowledgement that we want to, you know, take our precious resource. We're in Canada, we have far more than so many other places in the world, and that we want it to be there for our grandchildren and great grandchildren. What we don't want to end up is being put into crisis mode like many other places in the world are, and at that point realize, oh, now it's time to act. We have the luxury now of being able to act. Some might say that we're even getting too late on that front, depending on where in the country you live, but we're in a much better position than many places around the world. So we don't want to lose that. We definitely want our water to be sustainable and be around for many years to come.
Any other closing thoughts about what you'd like to see long-term for the agency, or even what you're looking for next steps?
I'm just speaking on that question, protection for future generations, that's one of our key principles and values that we have in our community is, we assess our decisions we make daily on how it's going to impact 7 generations down the road. And I feel like that's something that we all should be mindful of and think of. And I'm hoping that the development of the CWWA will see more stringent measures to ensure the protection of freshwater sources from various sources of pollution. And that be done in a very transparent, accountable, and holistic way.
Yeah, so, the stakes are high. It's great to see that this is going to happen. So I think, making sure that, things are smartly planned, go slow at the beginning, but then go fast. I think that we have time, but not a lot of time. So I think those priority sites are really important, and making sure that the right stakeholders and Indigenous communities are engaged, and, the right sort of, preparation so that partners are on side as soon as things are ready to go.
Yeah, thank you all. So we are coming to the end. Just as a final thought on that question, I echo everything that's being said. And I think, as we've talked about, a really key thing to do looking generations down the road is climate change projections. And we have a very uncertain future. That's a given. But there are ways that we can at least have different scenarios laid out and be prepared to react to each of those, and things we can do right now to build resilience to the climate change that's already happening and that we know that's going to intensify. So that's it. That went quickly. That was an hour and a really great discussion. So thank you very much to all of the panelists. Thank you to everybody who joined us for this session and submitted questions. I will note that we did not get to all the questions. We got a handful left over, so we'll do our best to answer those after the session in the chat. And as far as the conference goes, the next session is at 1 p.m. Eastern, and that is the National Issues for Canada and a Changing Climate. So that session will focus on climate change impacts and adaptation issues that are of national importance or that would benefit from an integrated cross-Canada perspective. So stay tuned for that one. It's coming up. And thank you all again for joining us. Take care.